Matt Mendez has worked on airplanes all of his adult life and is the author of the YA novel Barely Missing Everything and the short story collection Twitching Heart. He earned his MFA from the University of Arizona, where he also taught creative writing. His work has appeared in Pank, The Literary Review, one I can't pronounce that starts with an H. Husak is my best guess at that one, and other places. Matt is from El Paso, Texas, but now lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Tucson, Arizona. Mendez's debut novel, Barely Missing Everything, is a portrait of 2 Mexican-American families that holds nothing back from the readers. He has created a much-needed space for conversation around Latins in America and the hurdles they face. Matt Mendez knows how to make time for writing, having written his novel late at night in a Denny's in Tucson while working as an aircraft mechanic. He is an excellent author, and I'm so excited we get to the opportunity to hear from his voice today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Matt Mendez.
All right. Thank you so much. And that's huizache. Huizache is a tree that grows wildly in the Southwest and in Texas. It's kind of like a mesquite tree, and it's an unruly tree, so that's why it's named after. That's a literary journal out in Victoria, Texas, run by Dagoberto Gilb, and he named it that because we're an unruly bunch growing out there in Southwest and in Texas. So if you have a chance to check that literary journal out, it's pretty great. So I got a couple of things I want to read today. I want to read a short story from my short story collection, Twitching Heart. And like Lindsay said, I'm from El Paso, and I'm from the Southwest, and that's basically where the center of my being is. I'm a desert kid, and I've been in the military for 23 years. I've traveled around the world, and when my novel came out, I've got to travel the country and visit all sorts of places, and no matter where I go, if I'm gone for too long, like the call of the mountains and the cactus and the desert always kind of lures me, siren songs me back home to the dry desert landscape. And that's where I feel most at peace and most centered. And that's where the stories I love to tell and the people whose stories I love to tell are at. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to get started. So this first story I wrote, oh my God, probably like 10 years ago. And it's called Juan Looking Good. It's pretty short, and I'll talk a little bit about it after I'm done reading it and tell you how it leads into the novel. So here we go. Juan puts on his new shiny shoes. He likes them. And when he stands, his pant legs cover the thin laces and around the heel. The pants aren't baggy or tight, not jeans. They are dark gray slacks, sharp and straight. Juan's ma ironed his shirt, starched the collar and long sleeves. It smells like lemons. Juan's tucked in, first time since making communion. His ma bought the clothes on her credit card and paid for his haircut. Still close on the sides, but longer on top. Juan Steele, Richard, who works for the city and is the kind of Mexican who thinks he isn't, sprung for the lawyer. Juan checks himself in the mirror. Didn't know how good, looking good, would feel. His ma's worried what the judge will do and decides she'll skip court. Juan ties his tie as she tells him this, knots it so the end hangs just above his belt buckle, and then waits outside for Richard to pick him up. It's too hot for a jacket, but Juan wishes it wasn't, wishes his ma would have gotten him the blue blazer with the silver buttons. Juan has put his poor ma through enough. Everyone agrees, but maybe one more thing wouldn't have been too much to ask. At the courthouse, the lawyer instructs Juan to plead guilty. If he does, things won't turn out so bad. Richard tells Juan not to be stupid and sign the lawyer's papers. But Juan feels stupid after signing, after landing probation and a fine he can't imagine paying, a dirty record to follow him around. The judge explains how lucky Juan is to have one more chance. Juan's not sure where all his other chances have gone. And on the way home, his arm breezing outside the window of Richard's truck, he thinks maybe chances are like everything else, that some people get a lot and some don't. Thinking there's a reason to celebrate, Juan's ma throws a carne asada. His tios and tias, all his primas, come to the house. Even his nana is there in her wheelchair. Juan's friends show too. His boys slap him on the hand and back. The girls give hugs and tell him how fine he's looking. But Juan's friends want to leave after eating, after taking all the dirty looks his family's had for them. They tell Juan to change out of the white boy clothes, that it's time to really party. I'm gonna stay in tonight, Juan says, while looking down at his shoes. The square toes are as black as the mountains get at night and look just as good with the stars coming out. The party ends and everyone heads home. Before leaving, Richard reminds Juan that he's done bailing him out. And his nana says to take care of his ma because she's looking too skinny. Later, with his ma asleep, Juan locks the doors and goes to his room. He checks himself in the mirror one more time and thinks about changing for sleep, but decides to wear his new clothes just a little longer. The phone rings, but he doesn't answer. He opens the window and lies down, closes his eyes, and kicks off his shoes. The night air is cool and smells like greasy charcoal burning out. A train thunders behind the house, like one does every night, the chugging engines and blaring horns rattling the windows against their frames. Over the years, Juan has learned to ignore the commotion, but tonight the uproar buzzing in his ears and chest. Juan listens as the train slowly pulls away, until the noise becomes a whisper he can barely hear. That's that story. So I wrote that story, I would say about 8 or 9 years ago. And when I sat down to write Barely Missing Everything, that story kept echoing back to me. And I kept thinking about Juan. So much so that I named one of the narrators in Barely Missing Everything Juan. Because I kept thinking about the situation that Juan was in. He's not a privileged kid. He's not a kid that gets a lot of second chances. He's a kid who made a mistake, went to court, and now has a record. It's a kid that doesn't have a lot of second chances. So I started thinking about, privilege and, kids who aren't going to have the chance that, kids with a lot of other privilege have. And how where you're from doesn't determine the choices you make, but determines outcomes. So Barely Missing Everything is kind of the longer version of a story like Juan's. It's an exploration of that theme, of what happens to a boy like Juan. So Barely Missing Everything takes place in El Paso, in that same neighborhood in central El Paso. It's got 3 main characters. It's got another boy named Juan, his best friend JD, and Juan's mom Fabi. So Juan, in Barely Missing Everything, is a senior in high school, and he's the best player on the worst team, the best basketball player on the worst team in the district. And it's halfway through the season, and there's no scholarship opportunities coming. Not yet. And as he's wondering where those scholarship opportunities are, he's also wondering who his father is. Because that's Juan's big crisis in the book. He doesn't know who he is. And like most young people, most high school students, he doesn't know who he is or what his identity is. And he's wondering who he's going to be. That's a lot of young people's search, right? Aren't we all trying to figure out who we are? But when Juan looks in the mirror, he doesn't see a face he recognizes. And that's because his mom has never told him who his dad is. And then one day, Juan discovers a letter from a man on death row, a letter addressed to his mom. And Juan begins to wonder if this man could be his father. So Juan, with the help of his best friend, JD, planned to take a road trip to the middle of Texas to see if this is indeed his father. Now, JD is Juan's knucklehead best friend. And he's a little different than Juan. Juan's not the best player on the basketball team. He's also not the worst. He's in the middle. And at home, JD's in the middle too. He's got an older sister who's always telling him what to do, and a younger brother who's always tattling on him, ratting him out to his parents. And Juan, or JD I should say, also has a secret. JD has discovered that his dad is cheating on his mom. And he doesn't know what to do. And Fabi, our last point of view character, is Juan's mom. Fabi was pregnant with Juan her sophomore year in high school. And that's she got pregnant with Juan the same year her mom also died. So for Fabi, she's been dealing with a lot of the same issues and problems that young people deal with in high school. And as she's grown up, a lot of those problems and struggles have been unresolved. And now, as she has a son about to graduate high school, a son who's having some problems in school, she finds herself pregnant again, and she's not quite sure what to do. So the chapter I want to read, it's kind of in the middle of the book. Juan and JD were at a party where the cops had raided the party. Juan has spent the night in jail, and as a result, Juan has injured his ankle. He has a court date pending. Him and his mom been thrown out of their apartment, and Juan has one scholarship opportunity that his shady coach has said is coming his way. He's promised that a scout from Arizona is going to come watch him play basketball if he helps train another kid to replace him on the team, to learn his position. So Juan has a lot of things going on. He's got to pass a math test. He's got to train a point guard to help replace him on the team until he gets healthy. And he's living in a new house with his grandfather. So I'm going to pick up the story there after I take a sip of water. I'm doing a lot of talking. And a little note of his grandfather. His grandfather's a pretty eccentric guy. Juan watched Grandpa as he sat in the driver's seat of his 1965 Imperial Crown, listening to oldies. The sedan needed work. The leather interior was rotted from the sun and splitting along the seams, the dashboard cracked, and most of the wood paneling missing. The body needed paint too. The midnight black had blotched and faded to a dull purple, and the chrome trim around the fender and trunk had stripped away. The music sounded muffled, hissing like the songs played on a record player. Los Lobos sang, "Here I am, on the short side of nothing. I can't find my way home. No escape in sight." There's no way I'm singing any of their lyrics, by the way. The Imperial sat in the backyard, and had been there for as long as Juan could remember. Sometimes the hood was popped open, Grandpa messing around underneath it. The car seemed to be the one thing in the house that never got completely fixed. Just last month, Grandpa had installed a new main after the pipe burst in the front yard. When Ma asked why he just didn't patch the old one, he said he didn't want to risk another 100-year freeze bursting it again. Grandpa was crazy. "Does it run?" Juan called out, standing in the kitchen doorway. He didn't know if he should go into the backyard. The swelling on his ankle was finally down, but it felt sore. Walking in the dark through Grandpa's junky backyard seemed like a sure way to retwist it. Grandpa liked making Juan his helper when he visited. Usually when Juan was in trouble for something, the old man explaining the importance of being a good wrench, of being able to fix things. Not having to depend on no one, but having people need you, isn't a bad place to be, he once explained, while the two would sell the fuel pump on their neighbor's Chevy Impala. Juan didn't mind helping, but Grandpa didn't seem to be turning wrenches on the Imperial. When Juan and Roxanne had finished studying, he was surprisingly getting the hang of quadratic equations and moving on to probability. Roxanne booked, saying she wouldn't hang out with him until he passed his test. And then only if he quit acting so stupid, now that she was sure he wasn't actually stupid. She runs better than you, Juanito, Grandpa said. Get out here. I've been wanting to talk to you. Is that girl gone? And your mom too? Yeah, it's just us. Good, good. Juan took shotgun. He hadn't noticed Grandpa had been drinking. In fact, his abuelo was probably more than a little fucked up. A tall boy resting between his legs and a couple of empties tossed on the passenger floor. Juan had never seen Grandpa like this before. He'd never thought of how much time the old man spent alone, whether this was normal for him. Are you drunk, Grandpa? Nah, Grandpa said. He gripped and pulled at the steering wheel, as if correcting from a slow veering off. I just closed my eyes, just for a second, officer. I'm gonna have to take you in, Grandpa, Juan said, joking. Even though this car doesn't run, you're obviously a danger. Speaking of the law, let me tell you something, Juanito. Grandpa turned around and put his hand on Juan's shoulder, squeezed tightly. You're not gonna get nowheres, making all the mistakes you've been making, doing all the same pendejadas every other cabron out here does. Mexicans don't get second chances. Whoa, I was just joking, Grandpa. Take it easy. I know what you're saying. What do you know? About what? About what I'm saying. That I'm Mexican? Juan had no idea what Grandpa was trying to say. Don't be a smartass. Grandpa let go of Juan, gripped the wheel of the Imperial, and stared out the windshield. Grandpa's house, Grandpa's rules, Grandpa's crazy-ass words. Grandpa didn't know how long he should stay inside the car, if he was allowed to leave. Then Grandpa started up again. Look, gringos, especially the rich ones, they get to mess up. Tú sabes. They still get good lives, great lives. They go to private schools and colleges and get lawyers on the spot. That's why none of them got drafted to the war with me. Mira, when they get arrested for whatever bullshit you got arrested for, they get a second chance. They are boys being boys. That's what the judge will say about them. They didn't know any better. They'll grow out of it. They're good guys, but not you. If you want to have stuff go right, you can't be messing up. Es más, you have to do a whole lot better than not fucking up. You better be better than everyone around you. Trust me, I know. Is that right? Juan could see the wind-up for Grandpa's been there, done that speech. But he wanted to hear it anyway. He wanted a beer, too. Look, before I got drafted and went to Vietnam, before they shot me in the head and left me for crazy, I was gonna be an engineer. I had the best grades in school. The best. But I didn't know I needed to apply to the university before going, to be accepted. ¿Me entiendes? I thought I could just show up, fill out some papers, and go inside. Nobody ever told me how it was supposed to go. On the first day I showed up, they told me I couldn't get in until the next year. I tried to argue, to tell them how smart I was, pero ni modo. I got drafted a month later. I went to the war, to infantry. He sucked down the rest of his tall boy, and this time tossed the empty to the ground. That's fucked up, Grandpa. Juan knew the story of Grandpa's final mission, maneuvering through the jungle in an attempt to take some hill, when a sniper's bullet swiped the top of his helmet, knocking him unconscious. Juan had always thought Grandpa had been lucky to still be alive. He also realized that he hadn't applied to any school and didn't know how the whole thing worked. Was it already too late? He wondered if the coach from Arizona actually offering him a scholarship was enough to get him admitted. What if it wasn't? He thought of the draft, the country seeming to have been at war his entire life. What if they want that back? It's not too late for you. Not yet, but almost, Grandpa said. And you're wasting your time with basketball. That is for the blacks. Aye, Grandpa. Don't say stuff like that. It's racist. Grandpa studied Juan, his face pinched with confusion, and Juan was sure he seemed ridiculous to him, like a designer puppy or a robot created to play the trumpet. Don't I, Grandpa me. You could still get on with the city in some way or be a mailman. Federal has way better insurance. You're going to need that if you want to have a family. It's too late for you to be an engineer, too. For a moment, Juan imagined himself sitting in an office, wearing a blue short-sleeve button-down, matching blue shorts that didn't fit well, and black Velcro shoes, surrounded by stacks of coupons for fast food joints and envelopes with bills ready to be endlessly stuffed inside mailboxes. I was just studying algebra, and I could be an engineer if I wanted. With that girl in your room? You weren't studying. Yes, I was. No mames. You two were making babies, or trying to. Maybe you got lucky and you couldn't figure it out. Stay away from that girl before you ruin her, like your father ruined your ma. That's fucked up, Grandpa. He liked bullshitting with the old man, talking like he imagined other men talked. But on second thought, he added, Sorry, Grandpa. On the radio, Jose Feliciano sang Bill Withers' Ain't No Sunshine. The sound was still muffled and full of static. But Grandpa surrendered to the sound. An engineer. Juan wished he actually believed he could be one. He felt stupid for not really knowing what an engineer actually did. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. Ain't no sunshine when she goes away. And I know. Grandpa lightly pounded his fist against his thigh at each I know. I still miss your grandma, Juanito. Her being gone is still a punch to the heart, a punch every day. I'm sorry, Juan said, wishing the damn song were over. As the evening turned to night, Juan could see his breath. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, just black with a scatter of stars. He looked for the moon and thought of heaven, about praying. He'd asked God to give him a sign that things were going to work out. He'd be able to play, to get that scholarship. If not that, then maybe, finally, he could meet his dad. It was the least he could do. At least Grandma's in heaven, waiting for you. You can see her again, right? Grandpa pulled another tall boy from the cooler Juan hadn't even noticed on the ground outside the Imperial. He looked over at Juan and handed him the beer before reaching for another. Juan tried not to look surprised, just popped the tab and took a long drink. It felt good going down. He wanted his head to become light and for the buzzing feeling to come quickly. No one is waiting for me. I always tell people that she is, but that's just to make them feel better. So what? You think she's in hell? Juan shrugged again, not looking at Grandpa after asking. Cállate. What I'm saying is I don't think she's in heaven or hell. What she is dead. There's no such thing as Santa Claus, mijo. Didn't your mother tell you? Juan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, now really not wanting to look at Grandpa. Do you believe that because Grandma died? Juan had heard his ma say that before, that after her mama died, she quit believing, at least for a while. She asked how God could do that to a person, slowly waste them away, even after all that time she spent praying, begging. Wasn't that what Juan had just done? Begged for a scholarship? No, your grandma dying has nothing to do with it. ¿Por qué then? Juan never went to church, wasn't sure what religion he belonged to, if he belonged to one at all. He was certain he was baptized. He was Mexican after all. But he knew, for a fact, that he'd never made his first Holy Communion, and he didn't know what came after that. JD complained all the time that his mother made him go to church every Sunday, and on Saints' Day, and now he had to go to catechism every Sunday. JD liked to pretend he didn't believe, always pointing out contradictions or references to slavery in the Bible. But Juan suspected JD liked belonging somewhere, having a tribe. JD didn't have that luxury. Religion and faith were just two more things Juan was born without. Because of Noah's Ark, Grandpa said. That is why. Oh, because no way did all those animals fit on one boat? Juan guessed, taking another drink. And how come no one has found the boat? And if we all come from Noah, then how come we're not all white people, or Middle Eastern, or whatever Noah was? I saw some shit about it on the History Channel. It does sound like bullshit. What are you talking about? Grandpa said, now eyeballing Juan. If you can believe in God, then you can believe all that. That's easy. That's just faith. What then? Because he forgot the dinosaurs? No seas pendejo, Juan. Why don't you take anything serious? Come on, Grandpa. You're asking me to take a kid's story seriously. That is no kid's story. That cuento was about a God who murdered every man, woman, kid, and baby in the whole world. Grandpa took another pull from his beer and scooted closer to Juan. His eyes were bloodshot, droopy. Imagine the never-ending pile of drowned bodies left to rot when the sun dried everything up, and just one family forced to live through a planet being completely annihilated. Oh, that would suck, Juan interrupted, hoping to stop the conversation. But Grandpa wasn't having it. He poked his finger in the middle of Juan's chest. In the Bible, mijo, it says God flooded the world because mankind is wicked. But if a man drowned his wife and all his kids because they were no good, but saved all their pets for this next not wicked family, we wouldn't be worshiping that dude. No mames. Grandpa slid back to his side of the car and studied Juan, looking irritated. Mira, if we're wicked, it's because God's wicked. That's what I'm saying. If God's real, then sooner or later, we're going to flood the world. We're going to destroy everything. We are made to be monsters. Holy shit, Grandpa, Juan said, feeling drunk himself, and wondering if he was made to be a monster, if he was at least part murderer. Grandpa reached over, put him in a headlock, pulled Juan toward him, his hot breath radiating on Juan's face as he rested his head against Juan's. God has to be a big fake, because I just don't buy that. And besides, you're right about that stupid boat. No way could all the animals fit on that. Thank you. All right, Q&A. I would say it's probably about half and half. Some of it you draw from real life, and then when you start examining your own life, you realize how much of it is misinterpreted or how much about it you really don't know. So a little bit in the colloquium we talked about writing what you know. And then when you start investigating it, you realize there's so much of it that you don't know. So much of it, you find out how self-aware maybe you're not, and then how much about your family's history you don't know, how much about your culture you may have misunderstood, how much about your city you don't know. And then as you research and investigate, you realize that there's just these big gaps in your knowledge. And then as you write, you just start discovering all these different things. So even things that are based on your history and your family history become, fictionalized in all these different ways. So, even though things are kind of based on your life and your family life, everything just becomes, this mix of, fictional representation.
Your writing has a very distinct, like Mexican American dialect prose to it that you don't really have in your speech as much. Is that something that you research, or that kind of comes naturally to you, right?
Oh, I think that's just code switching. I talk and have that kind of vernacular all the time. It just comes out naturally when I'm writing, but I'm probably not going to address a crowd in some of that talk. That's just code switching back and forth. But I talk like that most of the time. Yeah. I'm probably not going to sit in here throwing F-bombs and doing all that. Yes.
Part of the tension in your fiction depends on a reality that of social inequity that a lot of us Anglos just don't get. How could we write fiction that would address those issues without being either culturally appropriative or blind or blind spots?
You mean write fiction from like what? From like this point of view?
From my own point of view.
That's a good question.
I'm not sure I'm clear, but that just
Well, I would say if you're reading widely and, experiencing or investigating these cultural inequities, I think your writing would reflect that and would reflect, your own blind spots, as long as you're investigating what your blind spots are, which everyone has these blind spots. And if you're, doing a thorough investigation of what those are and investigating them, I think your writing will, bring those out. Now, I think it's different if you're writing about other cultures and other people's, histories and cultures and backgrounds. I know there's always this big discussion of who has the right to do that and who can and should do that. I personally don't think writing outside my culture is, a thing to do. People have their stories to tell, and I don't want to say should tell those stories, but I think writing from somebody else's culture and somebody else's history is, a dangerous proposition, because the chances are you're just going to get it wrong. And the impulse to write from those cultures, if you want to write about somebody else's culture, you should ask yourself, what is my impulse to do that? Why do I have that impulse? I would just suggest reading widely from those cultures, because obviously there's a curiosity about those cultures, and I would investigate that curiosity versus trying to write about that curiosity. I think there's different ways to investigate that versus trying to write about it, because I always write to answer questions. So if you have that impulse as a writer to answer questions, I would find a different way to investigate it versus writing about it necessarily. Because if you have those blind spots, you may not, if you're writing about it, you're worried about the craft of fiction versus trying to answer those questions about inequity.
This may be more of a logistical question, but from your perspective, how privileged do you think the field is today? So, like, obviously, in olden times, we were flooded with a lot of books that were from old dead white guys. Do you think it is harder, or do you think it's becoming easier to be published, to have books that are published with this type of material?
I think it's easier, but not easy. So statistically, it's still, so I think books by, Latinx writers is still, I think, less than 10% of the books being published now. So it's still tremendously hard for a book like mine to get any kind of traction or air to breathe out in the publishing world. So it's still incredibly hard. I think there's more YA books published about animals than there are about brown people. So it's still incredibly hard if you're a person of color to have a book published today in 2019 still than in the olden times. I think it's getting better now, but there's graphs that come out by Vona and all sorts of different organizations that publish these kind of studies every year, and it's still incredibly hard if you're a Native American writer, if you're a black writer, you're a brown writer. It's still incredibly hard to have books published by major presses to come out and have the kind of awareness and the kind of publicity that white writers have.
Is there anything on this end that we can do about that to impact it?
Buy our books.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think that's what moves the needle. Is they'll tell you like, well, these books don't sell, which I don't think is true. I think people are buying our books, and thank you for inviting me to your school to come read. I think stuff like this is important, and I think just buying the books and showing that people are interested and want to hear these stories is vitally important. So thank you for having me. Oh, music is vitally important to me. I love to listen to music, and I listen to music when I write. So, like, I have 3 point of views in the book, but the 2 major point of views are Juan and JD. And the whole time I was writing the book, anybody listen to Run the Jewels in here? Anyone the hip hop fans? So to them, I love rap groups that go back and forth. So it has like the unifying production and the beat of the music, and then the 2 MCs that are going back and forth, and how they have the different sound quality to the voice, the different personalities going back and forth. And that's kind of what I wanted to mirror in the book when I was writing, to have those 2 that kind of feature in the book. These 2 young boys have 2 distinct voices kind of talking back and forth to each other, while the writing and everything else was kind of the same and had the same kind of underlying themes, the same kind of underlying prose, and the book to work as a unified whole. While I have these 2 voices kind of playing back and forth. So the book itself, I wanted it to have like a musical quality to it. And then of course I wanted to have song lyrics and music that I thought was, but people are listening to in Central El Paso, especially Grandpa, who's listening to, oldies. And I wanted to have like the oldies, because I would always remember being back home and having, my grandfather and my dad listening to all these old Jose Feliciano songs and Bill Withers and all that.
So, a collection of short stories is so hard to sell nowadays, and especially by a young writer. And I wondered if you published all those stories beforehand, or did you present a collection to a publisher and they went with them as a collection that hadn't ever appeared anywhere before, or is there kind of a story behind that? 'Cause it seems so rare that somebody's first publication would be a collection of short stories.
Yeah, usually about half the book has to be published in journals before anybody will kind of sniff at it. So every story in that book, except minus one, was published in a little journal before the publisher took it. And then the collection itself was, rejected a good 20, 30 times before Floricanto took it. So, but I think short stories now are kind of having a renaissance. I know there's been a couple of collections that have come out. Jason Reynolds just published a YA short story collection, which is fantastic. And I think short stories have been coming out rather recently. So there's been a few collections that have been making their way around. A Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin came out last year, which is great. That's what I was thinking of during our little talk, which is great. So with dialogue's tricky, because everyday conversations is full of a lot of ums and not, I guess, wouldn't serve a story. So in order to create realistic dialogue, I think you have to kind of mimic real speech, but at the same time, it has to kind of serve the story, serve what's going on in the scene without being expositional, which is a lot of, writer crafty talk, which means it has to serve the story. So in the scene I read, Grandpa and Juan are talking about, a lot of subtext. So Juan is trying to figure out his faith. He's trying to figure out what he believes. He's trying to find God. He's trying to figure out if he's going to get a scholarship. And he's talking this thing through his grandpa, who's kind of this eccentric character who's got PTSD that never got treated. And, he's lost his wife, who he misses still deeply, and he's an alcoholic. So he's having this conversation with his grandpa, and they're talking around these things. They never directly talk about this stuff. Instead, they talk about these they talk about these ideas, and they're having this conversation. And, you zoom in and out of Juan's point of view where he's, wants to get away from this conversation, but at the same time, he's trying to connect with his grandfather. So the dialogue never explains any of that stuff. So you want to have realistic dialogue. You want to have dialogue that doesn't explain what's going on. All that stuff's underneath the surface. So the rest of the writing has to support the dialogue. So your dialogue's never explaining what's happening in the story. So the dialogue can be punchy, it can be funny, and you want the dialogue to kind of like we were talking about earlier about how the dialogue has the flavor of the characters in there, but it's not explaining any of the action in the story. You don't want your dialogue to do too much work other than characterize the characters and, provide humor and be funny and, just kind of mimic regular speech, but not do too much work other than characterize your characters and, be funny if you can be.
So one of your narrators is the mom, so it's a little rare in an adult book to have an adult narrator. I wonder what made you make that choice, and if you ever got any pushback from agents or editors about that.
So I got like zero pushback from my editor. She was really on board right away. So I think she actually got pushback inside the publishing house for it. They were a little kind of, like, hey, what are you doing with an adult character here? But like me, she thought it was vitally important to have an adult character in a YA book. So to me, she serves as kind of an anchor in the story. So like when you grow up, you don't automatically have this well of wisdom that you can impart to young people. And also the conflicts you have growing up don't necessarily just dissolve because you've had a few birthdays. So, the conflict she's had with Grandpa was the same conflict she had when she was 16 years old. No spoiler alerts, but she was thrown out of her house when she got pregnant with Juan, and that conflict is still there, all these years later when Juan's in high school. And then in the course of the book, she has to move back in with her dad. So that tension is still there between her and her dad, having to live under her dad's rules and her not really being able to do it. And now her and her son have to live under those rules. So that tension, that underlying tension that she had as a 16-year-old is still there now that she's in her 30s. So to me, it was just fertile territory to explore as a writer, to show, young people and adults that, we're kind of in the same kind of territory. I know when I go back home, I instantly turn into a young person whenever I'm around my mom. She starts treating me like a kid, and I automatically feel like a kid. Then when I'm with my siblings, I automatically become the middle kid. It's like these roles that we play when we're young don't quite disappear just because we're older. My mom doesn't care that I'm a writer and that I'm a senior master sergeant in the Air Force. None of that matters. I'm the middle kid who's, runs my mouth too much. I automatically shrink to that size. I'm the little brother to my sister, and I'm an older brother bully to my little brother, and I just become that role, and there's just no escaping it. So to me, it was just good territory to explore in a book, and I thought it was the perfect place to put in a YA novel, and my editor agreed. And she doesn't take up a huge chunk of the novel. It's primarily the two boys, so I was able to, portion that out. I think we have about 5 more minutes. Yes?
So, did you set out from the beginning to write a story that addresses these issues, or was it just something you came up with as you wrote?
It's a little bit of a combo of the two. So when I talked a little bit earlier, and I probably should have jumped on it sooner. When I read the first short story from Twitching Heart, I really wanted to address, kind of what the first Juan was going through. So he had, he was, I don't talk too much. It's a real flash fiction piece, but he goes to court, and he just for something really minor, and then he's got a record, and he has probation, and these things are going to follow Juan throughout his life. So when I sat down to write this novel, I kind of wanted to explore that idea of you make this small transgression, and then the repercussion of these transgressions that follow these characters through the rest of their life. And that's what Grandpa is talking to Juan about in the car. It's like, hey, you can't be making these mistakes because the consequences for you are up here, and they're not for anybody else because all kids make mistakes. They all underage drink. They all are trying to, you know, figure out relationships, and you can get caught at the wrong place at the wrong time, but the consequences for you are way up here, and you're not going to get a second chance. If you want to have this, you can't do that. And it's this unfair situation that these kids are in because of where they live and where they're from. So like everybody's human, but for them, where they're at, the outcomes are going to be different. So their situation doesn't dictate human behavior, it dictates outcomes. And that's, you know, Juan's grandpa was inelegantly trying to tell Juan that. And to me, that was the idea I was trying to explore in the story. So yeah, I was very conscious of that when I was writing it. I just wasn't writing a didactic story. I was going to bludgeon people over the head with it. Yes?
So when it comes to using profanity in your dialogue and your text, how do you know where the line is when you want to add something for effect when you're like,
Yeah, it's a balance between being gratuitous and then being real to the world you live in. So it's a delicate balance because when you're writing for a YA audience, you want to make sure you're not being gratuitous, and at the same time, you want to make sure you're not being patronizing and you're talking in a way that young people aren't talking. So it's just a balance. And then me and my editor worked on that balance together. Because, you know, if you've ever been in a middle school or a high school, you know, kids talk this way. And if you use a language that feels inauthentic, they will smell a fake really quickly. And they'll be like, well, that's not real. That's not real. I'm done with this book because this book is patronizing. And at the same time, if you're just using cuss words gratuitously, then it becomes just shock value. And then all of a sudden you lose any kind of other kind of writing that you're trying to do. It becomes also inauthentic in a different way. So it's just a matter of balancing that out and figuring out the right way to do it, or a way that feels authentic and real to the world.
do you feel like there's a barrier that language uses when you're trying to get published? Like, what editors still use to have less or add more?
So a funny story, as if I have to wrap it up with this, is when I was trying to sell the book, my agent and I tried to do with an adult press too, and the adult press actually wanted me to tone down the language, where the YA press is like, nah, we're fine, this is good. And I feel that the YA press is more understanding of the audience that they're trying to reach, and they're not as patronizing, honestly. They're more upfront with the audience, and they understand their audience is better than the literary press. The literary press was more, I guess, maybe worried about prestige or whatnot. I'm not quite sure why they would want to tone down the veracity of the world, why they would want to turn the volume down and make it muted. Because to me, that's the way those characters talk, and that's the way that grandfather talked. And to mute that for an audience, to make it okay for an audience that, you know, didn't understand the world to begin with is odd. It's an odd choice. I think that's all the time we have, Spencer. Okay. Thank you so much.